do have copies of our calendar. This goes up through January, so please take a glance at that. All of our events are out on the website. We have a really nice interactive calendar, and you can actually, if you use like Google Calendar or some other calendar on your phone or computer, you can actually subscribe to the Tulsa Audubon calendar, so our events will show up on your calendar. So if you go out to the calendar, just click on, there's a little link that says, I think, subscribe or follow this calendar, and it'll tell you how to show it up on your Google Calendar or whatever calendar you use. Okay, and speaking of Flycatcher Trail, a project that Jim Deming completed a few months ago was we have a little library out there now, which is a converted newspaper box. And basically we're using it, putting field guides and other nature-related materials in there for people to borrow. And if they feel like they have to take it, then that's probably fine too. If someone wants to take a bird guide home with them, then that's good. So, but what we do is we do need old, if you have any old field guides or bird or nature-related books, particularly field guides, or any old like bird-related magazines, such as some old Audubon magazines or Birds in Bloom or Birding, those, rather than take those to recycle when you're done with them, donate them to us. You can get them you just bring them to the meeting, and we can use that to stock our little library at Flycatcher Trail and let some other folks, read those. Okay, so our other upcoming events are, so we talked about Monarchs on the Mountain next weekend. On September 28th is a field trip up to the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, and this is with the Northwest Arkansas Audubon Society. So we're going to meet 7 a.m. Saturday at the Hampton Inn in Bartlesville. And the details are on this page. And let's see, October 12th, those are the two things we have going in September. October 12th is Saturday Morning Birders. And next month, our monthly meeting is Dr. Ray Moran's talking about restoring and maintaining habitat for Oklahoma's pollinators. And Ray's going to be at Monarchs on the Mountain, right? Yep, so Ray will also be here this Saturday at the Monarchs on the Mountain. And we'll have him back in October to speak to us. I think that is all I have for tonight. I had a recorder's report, but it's on my phone, which I left at home, so I don't have that for you. Anything else I'm forgetting to mention? Oh, yes. Yes.
We're needing refreshments for our meetings for the remainder of the year. So I'm going to pass the sign-up chart. There's 3 slots for each meeting. 2 people would ask to bring food, and 1 person would bring 3 bottles of pop. If you're afraid that you would forget or not be able to do it, don't worry. I will always remind you, and if you can't do it, then we'll just fill in. Somebody else will fill in. So please sign up. Thank you. Me, but they were left over from May when we canceled our meeting. I had them in the freezer.
So okay, real fresh refreshments. Okay, anything else I'm forgetting to mention? If not, Cheryl Kilpatrick will introduce our speaker.
It's good to see all of Todd's students here tonight. Glad you guys came and gals came. I think you're in for a real treat too. Our speaker tonight is Samantha Cady, who is a research assistant in Dr. Sam Fullendorf's lab at Oklahoma State University in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management. Usually I mess that up, but I got it pretty good tonight. Samantha is a graduate of UC Santa Barbara, where she got her BS in aquatic biology. I have to mess something up at least during every introduction. She has worked as a wildlife biologist for the California Institute of Environmental Studies, and that's when she did some of the work on the Channel Island seabirds. She's also been field biologist for Northwind River Resource Consulting at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and also research analyst for Solution Strategies International. So she has quite a resume already before she even is completely finished with her PhD, which will be soon, I think. She's also a scientific diver and a wilderness first responder, so think of some good questions to ask her after her talk. And please welcome Samantha.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here tonight. Thanks for having me. Any day that I get to talk about seabirds is a really good day in my book, so I'm excited to get started. It's an excuse to have like a captive audience where I can just throw pictures of seabirds at you guys, and I'm pretty excited about that. So today I'm going to be talking about seabird ecology and its associated restoration projects on the Channel Islands of California. All right, so just to start off a little bit, just to give a broad overview about where I've been and where I'm going now. I was raised in California. I got my bachelor's in aquatic biology from UC Santa Barbara, where I mostly studied kelp forests and kelp forest systems. Seabirds were kind of bridging the gap from aquatic systems to more terrestrial systems, and now I've landed on birds. So I'm in the Great Plains. I did my master's at Oklahoma State with Dr. Tim O'Connell. I'm guessing that might be kind of a familiar name here. He's a very birdie person. He's very active in the Payne County Audubon Society. And now I'm working on my PhD. I finished up my master's last year, and I'm working with Dr. Sam Fullendorf and Craig Davis on the Northern Bobwhite project. We're also studying other birds as well, but bobwhite are sort of the hallmark of that project. So to begin with kind of a roadmap about what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to tell you kind of three broad stories about seabirds and restoration. And I'm going to talk about three different islands on the California Channel Islands. I'm going to talk about Santa Barbara Island, which is going to be about merlets, auklets, and storm petrels. Okay. I'm going to talk about Santa Cruz Island, where we created little apartments for ashy storm petrels. Okay. And finally, I'm going to talk about Anacapa Island, which is not a project that I was personally involved in. It happened before I became a biologist at all, but it's just so interesting I wanted to kind of talk about it a little bit. Okay. So, background, islands and seabirds. Seabirds really rely on islands. Islands are special because a lot of them lack land predators, and that makes it really easy for seabirds to go ahead and nest there successfully. They look really rugged and hostile, but they're really an island is really a place that a lot of different seabirds will call home, and they're uniquely suited to help seabirds with their needs. Okay. So I worked on the California Channel Islands Seabird Project. The company that I worked for was called the California Institute of Environmental Science, and they're funded through the Montrose Settlement, which was the DDT settlement. So because DDT harmed seabirds through eggshell thinning and reduced nest success, that funding went towards seabird projects, which are suited to monitor as well as restore seabird habitat. So part one, Santa Barbara Island. This is where I spent most of my time when I worked on the Channel Islands. It's a very small island. It is 1 square mile. You can see it's highlighted there in red. It is one of 5 of the Channel Islands that is owned and operated by the National Park Service. Okay. It's about 40 miles from the mainland, so it's quite a trek to get out there. That's a picture of it there, and it's pretty small, nondescript. There's no trees. The tallest vegetation is about waist high, so it's an interesting little place to be. And the way that the project was set up was 1 or 2 of us would go out there for a week or 2 at a time, and we'd be the only people on island. So that presented a lot of challenges. And I got to do a lot of kind of weird but fun tasks, like I learned how to operate a crane, I learned how to drive a boat, and just basically anything that they needed out there, we were kind of the only people out there to help out. So it was kind of a fun project to work on. Plus, I got to interact with a lot of seabirds. So on Santa Barbara Island, historically, there was a plethora of native perennial plants, a lot of woody shrubs, and plants that were really conducive to seabird nesting. A lot of seabirds need these plants to nest on, like auklets, for example, will burrow under the root structures of these plants. So when there was a lot of native cover, auklets tended to do really well. Okay. But unfortunately, the last century or so, there's been a lot of impacts. There were goats on the island, there were rabbits on the island, there were cats on the island. So it was really a 1, 2, 3 punch. The goats ate a lot of and rabbits ate a lot of the native plants, and the cats obviously ate a lot of birds. So long story short, the goats, rabbits, and cats were all eradicated, but what was left was really this monoculture of an invasive plant called ice plant, which is a low-growing, it just forms these mats that are just very short in stature and do not form really good habitat for seabirds to be able to use. So our goals were to restore native plants to better approximate the historic habitat so that it would encourage these birds to nest on this island, as well as monitor their abundance and nest success. So this is a picture of one of our restoration plots on Santa Barbara Island. You can see the line kind of down maybe the first third of the page, where it's just ice plant. All that light green stuff is all ice plant. And we're out there on our hands and knees pulling it out. And that's probably how I spent most of my time on that island, was just hands and knees mechanically removing that ice plant.
Hey, Sam, can we
yeah.
ask a fast question?
Yeah.
It's 40 miles from the mainland.
Yes.
Do cats really swim that well?
Yeah. No, they don't, do they? I'm not sure what the story is behind how cats got out there, but I know that the ice plant was brought out for, well, it was people, but I don't know, the ice plant was brought out for erosion control, and the rabbits were brought out for a food source for when people were posted on the island. And goats were also brought out by people who were living on the island. I'm not sure what the function of the cats were, but they were there. Definitely brought by people. Okay. So you want to restore an island. The first thing you got to do is grow some plants. An interesting thing about island restoration is, although there are plants of the same species that occur on the mainland, we kind of had to propagate everything on the island because we were afraid of accidentally bringing something out that didn't belong, that could potentially cause harm by invading. So we collected all seeds on island, and we grew all of our plants on island, which was challenging. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. It's challenging because we didn't have any groundwater on the island, so we had to ship out a lot of the water, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But after you grow a bunch of plants, the next thing you do is outplant them. And we wanted to get all these plants, which were often thousands at a time, in the ground around the same time so that we could care for them at the same time. Because at a certain point, we need to wean them off of our care so that they can survive in the wild and hopefully outcompete some of the invasive plants. So to do that, we brought out teams of volunteers, and these were always really fun weekends, and everyone kind of won because this little island, Santa Barbara Island, doesn't have regular transportation. So most people don't really visit that island, and if they do, it's because they have their own boat. So people got to come out, camp, and enjoy the island, and we got to have help putting plants in the ground, and it ended up just kind of being like a big garden party, and it was really fun. We did it twice a year and put thousands of plants in the ground that way. And then after you put them in the ground, they're going to be kind of fragile for about a year or so, sometimes more. So you got to supplementary water them to give them that fighting edge to hopefully outcompete the ice plant. We know that we're going to have about half mortality going into it, so the goal is to just plan them as tight as possible and kind of hope for the best. Restoration challenge number 1. There's no groundwater on the island, so we actually have to bring it all out with us. And that was a huge cost and a lot of work. And the rainfall is extremely low. There's only about maybe 3 inches of rain a year, sometimes less, sometimes a little more, but it's not very reliable. So these plants really had to be watered to get that competitive advantage against the ice plant. So like I said, we actually ship out our water, and every time we would do a personnel switch where there's 2 people on the island and we're switching out for 2 more, we'd bring with us about 4, sometimes more, totes of 600 gallons of water. and we would crane it from the boat onto the island. Our second major challenge is we don't have any heavy equipment on the island. There's no roads or really much infrastructure. There is housing. It's pretty great housing as far as field housing goes. There's electricity, it's all solar. But there aren't roads and we don't have trucks. So to deal with that and get to all of our restoration plots, which are the color polygons up there, they're not that far apart, maybe a kilometer or two, but it does make a difference when you're packing around herbicide and stuff. So we just carry everything. We got really strong. And the frame pack became our best friend. The frame pack is that image up in the right-hand corner. You can just tie whatever you want to it, and we would carry around herbicide and hoses and all that stuff. I was much fitter when I was working on that project. And then another restoration challenge is sometimes the seabirds themselves. So there's a huge western gull nesting population out on Santa Barbara Island. And when they're nesting, I don't know if anyone in this room has been around nesting gulls or terns, they get very territorial, especially when there are chicks. Their hormones are going crazy and they will swoop you and hit you pretty hard. And in case you're wondering, that is the last thing you see before you get hit in the head by a western gull. So did it work? Yeah, it did. It took a while. The plants had to get big enough for the murrelets to get interested in them. But we did find our first nesting murrelet in a restoration plot in 2015. That's actually a picture of a murrelet chick that hatched out that day. We were very excited to find it. And since then, we found more. It's been really exciting to see them popping up in different restoration sites. And we count it as a win. And on top of the birds nesting, looking back on it, we've restored over 7 acres. I played a very small role in it. The project was going before I got on it, and it's been going on since I left. I've only been there for 2 years, but it still is pretty cool to look at the maps of what was restored and what wasn't restored. And kind of what I thought was maybe more fun than pulling ice plant was getting to monitor the seabirds. So we got to go out and do nest checks. We got to do surveys. We got to band the birds. And the focal species of Santa Barbara Island was the Scripps murrelet, the ashy storm petrel, and the Cassin's auklet, all pictured up there. So the Scripps murrelet, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting one, are about this big. They're about the size of a softball. They're counter-shaded, so like a penguin or an orca, where you can see that the top is black. So if you're a predator looking down on the bird in the water column, it's going to blend in with the dark water underneath. Whereas if you're a predator looking up, it's going to be light and contrast with the light coming from above. So they're a classic seabird color. Okay. And something notable about them is that they're highly pelagic. So they are at sea almost all of their life. They only come to land to breed. So it's pretty remarkable that something so small and that looks so fragile can just survive out in the open ocean for most of their life. Notably, they're crevice nesters, so they'll nest in little rocky crevices. They'll also opportunistically use shrubs, which is why we were planting these big, hopefully big native plants that were going to be a nice murrelet habitat when they reach maturity. And something that's really cool about these birds in particular is their young are very precocial. That means that as soon as they hatch, they are ready to go. It's really neat to watch. We put a camera in some of these birds' nests, and you could see that, so they fledge the night or the night after they hatch. So it's pretty remarkable. And you'll see that these, there'll be a parent sitting next to 2 chicks, typically, and the second parent will come into the nest and it'll kind of be like, come on, van's packed, ready to go. And then the 2 parents head out. And then you can see the 2 fluffball chicks, sort of one after the other, gaining the courage to jump off these 100-foot rocky cliffs into the surging Pacific below.
Hey, Sam?
Yeah.
You mentioned pelagic lifestyle. Can you kind of underscore what that means? And do they float or do they fly all the time?
Sure, good question. Yeah, what I mean by pelagic is open ocean. So there's different parts of the ocean. Some are coastal, some are intertidal, which would be like tide pools between the tides. And then there's the pelagic, which is just open ocean, no structure, water as far as the eye can see. So that's classic pelagic. And as far as what the birds do when they're out there, when I've seen them, it's been during breeding season, so that's kind of a bias. I don't know what they do when they're not breeding. But sometimes they're floating around on the top of the water. They swim very well and catch all sorts of prey while they're swimming. And they do this remarkable thing. Usually when you're just about to catch them, they can actually go from swimming underwater to flight without resting on top first. They just shoot out of the water. So they're remarkable. I would say they're better swimmers than they are flyers, but I do see them sitting on the water a lot.
Do the parents feed the young ones, or do you know?
I would assume, but I've never seen it.
Just going out in the open ocean.
And the
really
little,
stay together.
Yeah, they stay together, and the chicks are so buoyant. I don't think they can swim yet when they're that young, so they're almost like little cotton balls. So I would assume the parents would have to, but I've never seen it. So some of the challenges of monitoring these nests is they don't nest in very comfortable places for humans. So that cliff with the rainbow behind it on the far left side is one of our nest sites that we would check. And so it's rugged and steep and difficult to access. You can see my roommate Katie there on the far right is demonstrating some of the tight squeezes that we have to make to check the nests for these birds. And we did build them nest boxes that we would put under the dock. We found that they tend to really like crevices where they can go in and turn a corner. So we made them a box where they could go in and turn a corner. And they love those things. All those nest boxes were almost full every year, and they tended to hatch out successfully. So when you're monitoring a nest, what will kind of cue you into an active nest is you'll see an egg. So these birds don't really put together nests in a way that you would think of with a songbird, where they're collecting materials and getting ready before the egg arrives. They just sort of scooch some pebbles away and then lay their egg. So you'll see an empty hole, and then you'll see an egg, and then a week later you'll see 2 eggs, and then you'll see a bird sitting for about a month, and they'll incubate both those eggs for about a month. Until then you'll usually see eggshells because the chick is in the nest for such a short, like 24-hour period that you only get to see them. You have to get kind of lucky. I monitored them for 3 seasons, and I've probably only seen 5 chicks maybe. So you got to get pretty lucky. You got to see them right when they hatch. So to show a little bit of data that we collected, so the Scripps Merlet data it's a little bit noisy. It's hard to tell because they have these sort of, I don't want to say boom bust, but they're highly correlated with the mouse population, which is highly correlated with rain. So rain produces a bunch of seeds, and if the seeds become very numerous, it'll make the mouse population go up, and then they'll start to put pressure and depredate the eggs. So indirectly, drought actually affects seabirds, which is sort of an interesting thing. And that was Sarah Thompson just released a paper about that. If you're interested in more, it came out in 2019 that it goes over that whole cycle. But this graphic here, it's kind of short-term data, so it's hard to draw any conclusions about any strong trends, but you can see that as depredation, the green line goes down, clutch success and egg success tend to go up. And depredation is usually a mouse. So the other thing we did was we wanted to look at survivorship and just try to get some raw population density estimates. How many birds are there? So to do that, we would do these round island surveys on skiffs, and then we would also capture and band with the hopes of hopefully recapturing these merlets. And it was kind of challenging because they're pretty active at night. They're out in these rafts, and they're calling to one another, and it almost just looks like they're socializing at night. And so we would go out and try to catch them during that time. We didn't want to pull them off the nest because we were afraid they would abandon, so we tried to just catch them on the water. And to do that, it's kind of challenging to get a skiff in the water using a crane at night when you can't really have big lights because it'll actually attract seabirds. So we tried to do it as dark as possible, and you can see that picture on the left. It's not easy to put a skiff in the water using a crane at night, but it was just one of the fun challenges to get around. So the way a night capture goes is it's generally 3 people on a skiff, 1 person at the till or at the engine, 1 person in the middle with the spotlight, and that was usually me, and then someone on the bow with a net. The reason why I like to be the spotlighter is because when someone would get it with the net, I would get to be the one to take the bird out of the net, and I always thought that was pretty fun. So the person with the spotlight would find a bird, shine a light on it, and say bird, and then the person at the till would rev the engine. We would go at that bird pretty fast, and then someone would dip it out of the water, and hopefully you catch it. Often you don't. They're pretty quick. And then once you do that, you can see the picture on the right is one of the technicians grabbing that bird out of the net, and we're going to be banding it and taking some rudimentary measurements. So once we catch the bird, we fit it with an aluminum band. And one of the interesting findings from banding this bird was that we found the oldest murrelet that we know of so far, which is 22 years old. It was banded on a previous project, and when we captured it, it was pretty exciting because it's a really old bird. So these birds can reach pretty mature ages when conditions are right. So now I'm going to move us to Santa Cruz Island. It's a much bigger island. It's about 20 miles across. It's still on the National Park Service land, so owned and operated by National Park Service. Notably, more than half the island is actually operated by the Nature Conservancy, but the part that we were working on was National Park Service land. And something that's different about this island is that it does have land predators. So there is an endemic spotted skunk and fox. And what endemic means is that it's native only to that place in the entire world. So that's the only place that you'll find those 2 animals, the Santa Cruz Island skunk and the Santa Cruz Island fox, is on that island. So they're pretty special little critters. And you might think maybe it's not good for seabirds, but actually it still is, because there's a lot of offshore islets that are free of these land predators, as well as a lot of rocky cliffs that have caves in them that just aren't accessible to land predators, but they do still have really great seabird habitat. So on Santa Cruz Island, our goal was to, much like Santa Barbara Island, restore native plants to better approximate historic perennial cover. Same challenges as Santa Barbara Island. No groundwater on that little islet. There is groundwater on Santa Cruz Island, but we still had to get it to this little islet. I was only involved in the very tail end of this project, and I got to just sort of do some of the monitoring, but most of the native plant vegetation had already been restored once I was on the project. And another thing that we wanted to do here was, again, monitor seabird abundance and nest success. This project mostly had Cassin's auklet in mind. That's that little brown fluff ball. That's a Cassin's auklet chick. We're pulling it out of some of the artificial habitat that was placed on that offshore rock around some of the new native plant restoration plots. Notably, Cassin's auklet has declined considerably, around 50 to 60% declines. So it was pretty important to sort of hopefully get some of this habitat up and running to just give them more areas that are good opportunities for them to nest without predators. And again, ice plant is sort of still the enemy out there. There's a lot of it, and ice plant as well as other non-native annual plants that are short stature and not great for nesting. So we wanted to get rid of those and put in some bigger, more structurally just better plants for the birds to nest under. And I think I mentioned before, auklets are burrow nesters, so they have almost little claws, and they can actually burrow under these root structures, and that's how they nest. So interestingly, this is what the plot looked like in 2007. And in 2014, you can see that there's pretty substantial cover there. And there's also a lot more auklets there as well because they have much more root structure to nest under. This is pulled from a report written by my boss, Dave Mazurkowitz. The blue bar is kind of what I'd like to draw your attention to. That is Scorpion Rock, the restoration project that I was talking about. And the blue bar, the height of the blue bar represents the percent occupied auklet nests. And you can see that there, after the restoration project was underway and the plants had a couple years to kind of gain footage and grow a little bit, the occupied nests really shot up as well. The picture on the right is a natural Cassin's auklet burrow. It's underneath a Coreopsis plant. And those are root structures. It's kind of hard to tell what's what, but right in the middle of that picture, that black area is a Cassin's auklet burrow. So they're actually using that vegetation that we planted, and it's a kind of a happy ending. And they also made a bunch of cool little auklet condos. So auklets are burrow nesters, but they'll also opportunistically use cavities. So they created some auklet boxes or auklet condos using just corrugated plastic tubing, and then it would kind of end in this chamber that was also very convenient for us because we could, it's a lot easier to nest check when all you have to do is lift a lid rather than try to figure out what's in that burrow. And the auklets really liked it. So there's a picture of a Cassin's auklet headed right toward its artificial habitat, and they use that pretty frequently as well. And then we also got to monitor ashy storm petrels. They're very small, robin-sized tube noses, also pelagic, so open water birds. And that is an image of probably, I think, the first time I held an ashy storm petrel chick, and it's 95% fluff. You grab it, and it's incredible how small the frame of the bird is when it looks like it's just this big fluff ball. And then there's an adult pictured on the left, much sleeker looking bird. And they really like to nest in these cliffs or in these sea caves that are surrounded by cliffs because of the infrequency or absence of land predators.
Is this the only place you find them?
Ashy storm petrels? I don't know what their range is. Not this island. I know there's other islands, but I don't know how far it extends. So the caves are perfect for them. They're surrounded by sheer cliffs, so if a skunk were to try to get down there, it would fall and not do well. So they're pretty well protected, except ravens. So ravens can access the caves just as easily as the ashy storm petrels can. And once they discover a cave, they can really do some pretty severe damage to the population. So there's a picture of a raven trying to do just that. So our goal for this wasn't so much restoration or native plants, it was to sort of try to create a structure that could provide good nesting habitat for these ashy storm petrels while discouraging or inhibiting raven depredation, and as an added bonus, with holes so that we could monitor the nests. So it took a couple different prototypes. But eventually, we found something that worked. There's a picture of a nest and an ashy storm petrel, or an egg and an ashy storm petrel successfully nesting in those little ceramic apartments. And as far as we know, the ravens haven't been able to figure it out yet. They're pretty smart, so hopefully. It is difficult to access these caves. We do it one of two ways. The first way is, they're both really fun, is a skiff drop-off. So it's a little inflatable boat, and then the boat driver will nose us right up, and you just jump out and hope for the best. And then you get to jump back in as well, but you got to time it with the surge pretty well, and I definitely have to say that I was glad that we wear helmets because they have saved me on more than one occasion. Or we just simply kayak there. Takes a little bit of finessing, but the rocky intertidal landing isn't always comfy, but it's rewarding and fun. So again, they don't nest in places that are conducive to land mammals, including humans. So it takes a lot of crawling and squeezing and swimming to eventually get to where we can monitor the nest success of these birds. And we also misnetted for them. So usually when we think about misnetting, we're thinking about songbirds or passerines. But we can also misnet for seabirds, especially because these are such small seabirds. They're about the size of robins, and they're highly responsive to call playback. So we would go up, they're very nocturnal. We would go up in the middle of the night, 2 in the morning, set up our mist nets, start playing soundtrack of Ashley Storm Petrel calls, and it doesn't take very long. It takes maybe a few minutes for the birds to start showing up.
What is a mist net?
A mist net is a very fine mesh net the goal of it is to be imperceptible to birds. And so it's just really, really fine, and you just set it up, and it's usually, maybe from here to that table long. Those are 2 pictures of them up there, and hopefully the birds can't see it and just fly into it. And they get stuck, yeah. Yeah, they have a little...
Spider web?
I'm sorry?
It's like a spider web?
Yeah, it's not sticky, but the mesh will they'll kind of get tangled in it. And if you set it up right, it kind of almost has a bag. So the goal is that they'll fall, they'll hit, and they'll drop into a little pocket, and then you can disentangle them.
That's awesome.
And then we, like I said, disentangle them, which can be kind of a feat. And then after that, we take some just really quick measurements. We want to get them out of our hands as quick as possible so we don't stress them out. We put an aluminum band on them and send them on their way. So now I'm going to talk about a project that I didn't get to work on. It was ended long before I started out, but on Anacapa Island, which is just slightly bigger than Santa Barbara Island, which is a square mile, so it's a little over a square mile. It's tiny. It also doesn't have any groundwater. It is managed by the National Park Service. And again, no land predators. So there are peregrine falcons and things like that, but there are no land predators. So black rats were introduced to Anacapa Island sometime before 1939. We don't know exactly when or for sure how, but we think they were probably a stowaway on a ship. And they had these just detrimental impacts to the murrelet nest success. So they would eat eggs like it was going out of style. And I remember talking to my boss who worked on the project, and he said that it was just really depressing to go out and do nest checks, because he said that they just all would fail. They would just get eaten by these black rats, and so the murrelets were in some pretty big jeopardy, because as far as Scripps murrelets go, Anacapa Island is one of the biggest nesting colonies in the world for them, so it's pretty important that that remains up and running so that they can get numbers out to sustain their population. So this rat eradication, the park decided that enough was enough. They needed to do something about these rats, because it was going to really start to impact the Scripps' murrelet if they couldn't get off successful clutches. So the project had a lot of challenges. There were extensive, steep, rocky cliffs, so that made it really inaccessible to people. There's also a lot of species on that island that we care about, that we didn't want to impact. So there's a native endemic deer mouse out there, there's raptors, and there's all sorts of stuff that, that was in danger of being impacted by any big culling effort for rats. So what the solution was, they applied a baited rodenticide and dropped it from a helicopter with the idea that they would poison the rats. So what about the endemic mouse and all the raptors? It was definitely a high-risk, high-reward project, but they had a couple fail-safes. So the first thing they did was they collected every single raptor on that island. So it's a 1-by-1 square meter or square mile island. So it's a small island, and it's actually doable. And so they held them all in captivity. And they also held a subpopulation of the endemic deer mouse in captivity. And then one more thing they did was because Anacapa Island it's kind of convenient actually for this project, that it's separated into 3 distinct islets that have water between them. So they only treated one at a time with the idea that if something went wrong, they could halt and then have the other two repopulate that other islet. So,
Can they keep the raptors on that island, but just confined, or?
I think so. I do not know for sure how they did it. I just know they kept them. I would imagine there's housing and stuff up there, but I'm not positive on that. So, as you can imagine, highly controversial, high risk, high reward, but they went through with it. And it worked. Miraculously, the raptor population is healthy out there. The endemic deer mouse is doing just fine. It's business as usual, except now, if I draw your attention to this graph, you can see it represents rat trap success. So in 2001, the far left side of that x-axis, you can see high trapping success, and then it drops to 0. So no more rats on that island. And the murrelets followed suit. So these are 3 different ways of showing that the murrelets bounced back. Percent occupancy, percent eggs hatched. Post-eradication, so after the rats were gone, much better nest success. And then on the right is percent eggs depredated, and it took a nosedive. So the rats weren't eating the eggs anymore. So just a couple closing remarks. Invasive species do have a huge impact on island systems, and seabirds in particular, because seabirds rely on these islands being predator-free or land predator-free. Restoration is costly and labor-intensive, and so it's hard to, once a regime shift has happened, it's hard to put it back. It takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And there's really no instant gratification. I mean, the rat thing was sort of that isn't usually how restoration works out. But sometimes it does, sometimes it can't work.